Section 30 of The Wit and Humor of America, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Leeson. The Champion Checker Player of Ameriky, by James Whitcomb Riley. Of course, as fur as checker playin's concerned, you can't jest exactly claim it lots makes fortunes and lots gets busted at it, but still it's only simple justice to acknowledge 'at there's absolute p'ints in the game 'at takes scientific principles to figger out, and a mighty level-headed feller to demonstrate, don't you understand? Checkers is a old enough game, ef age is any recommendation, and it's a evident fact, too, 'at the tooth of time, as the feller says, which for the last 6,000 years has gained some reputation for eatin' up things in general, don't 'pear to a gnawed much of a hole in checkers, jedgin' from the checker board of today and the ones 'at they're occasionally shovelin' out at Pompeii, er whatever its name is. Turned up a checker board there not long ago, I was readin' 'bout, 'at still had the spots on, as plain and fresh as the modern white pine board o' ourn, squared off with pencil marks and pokeberry juice. This is facts 'at history herself has dug out, and of course it ain't for me ner you to turn up our nose at checkers, whether we ever tamper with the fool game or not. Fur as that's concerned, I don't pretend to be no checker player myself, but I knowed a feller once 'at could play, and sorto' made a business of it, and that man, in my opinion, was a genius. Name was Wesley Cotterell, John Wesley Cotterell, jest plain Wes, as us fellers round the shoe shop used to call him, used to allus make the shoe shop his headquarters like, and rain or shine, wet or dry, you'd allus find Wes on hands, ready to banter some feller for a game, er jest a settin' humped up there over the checkerboard all alone, a cipherin' out some new move or 'nother, and whistlin' low and solemn to hisself and a payin' no attention to nobody. And I'll tell you, Wes Cotterell was no man's fool, as sly as you keep it. He was a deep thinker, Wes was, and ef he'd jest a turned that mind o' his loose on preachin', for instance, and the 'terpretation of the Bible, don't you know, Wes 'ud a worked p'ints out there 'at no livin' expounderers ever got in gunshot of. But Wes he didn't 'pear to be cut out for nothin' much but jest checker playin'. Oh, of course, he could knock round his own woodpile some, and garden a little, more or less, and the neighbors used to find Wes purty handy 'bout trimmin' fruit trees, you understand, and workin' in among the worms and caterpillars in the vines and shrubbery and the like. And handlin' bees, they wasn't no man under the heavens 'at knowed more 'bout handlin' bees 'n Wes Cotterell, settlin' the blame things when they was a swarmin', and a robbin' hives, and all such foolish resks. Why, I've seen Wes Cotterell, 'fore now, when a swarm o' bees 'ud settle in an orchard, like they will sometimes, you know. I've saw Wes Cotterell jest roll up his shirt sleeves and bend down a apple tree limb 'at was jest kivered with the pesky things, and scrape 'em back into the hive with his naked hands, by the quart and gallon, and never get a scratch. You couldn't hire a bee to sting Wes Cotterell. But lazy? I think that man had r'aly ort to 'a been an Injun. He was the first and only man 'at ever I laid eyes on 'at was too lazy to drop a checker man to p'int out the right road for a feller 'at asked him once the way to Burke's Mill. And Wes, without ever a liftin' eye or finger, jest sorter crooked out that mouth o' his'n in the direction the feller wanted, and says, "Hey yonder," and went on with his whistlin'. But all this ain't checkers, and that's what I started out to tell ye. Wes had a way o' jest nat'rally a cleanin' out anybody and ever'body 'at 'ud hep hold up a checkerboard. Wes wasn't what you'd call a lively player at all, ner a competitor 'at talked much 'crost the board er made much fuss over a game while he was a playin'. He had his faults, of course, and would take back moves 'casionally, er inch up on you ef you didn't watch him, maybe. But as a rule, Wes had the insight to grasp the idea of whoever was a playin' against him, and his style o' game, you understand, and was on the lookout continual, and under such circumstances could play as honest a game o' checkers as the babe unborn. One thing in Wes's favor allus was the feller's temper. Nothin' 'peared to aggravate Wes, and nothin' on earth could break his slow and lazy way o' takin' his own time for everything. You jest couldn't crowd Wes or get him rattled anyway. Just 'peared to have one fixed principle, and that was to take plenty o' time, and never make no move without a cipherin' ahead on the probable consequences, don't you understand? "Be sure you're right," Wes'd say, and lettin' up for a second on that low and sorry-like little wind through the keyhole whistle o' his, and a nosin' out a place where he could swap one man for two, "Be sure you're right," and somethin' after this style was Wes's way, "Be sure you're right," whistlin' a long, lonesome bar of Barbara Allen, and then another long retarded bar, "Go ahead." And by the time the feller'd git through with his whistlin', and a stoppin' and a startin' in agin, he'd be about 3 men ahead to your one. And then he'd jest go on with his whistlin' 'sef nothin' had happened, and maybe you jest a rearin' and a callin' him all the mean, outlandish, ornery names 'at you could lay tongue to. But Wes's good nature, I reckon, was the thing 'at helped him out as much as any other p'ints the feller had. And Wes'd allus win in the long run, I don't care who played against him. It was only a question o' time with Wes a waxin' it to the best of 'em. Lots o' players has tackled Wes, and right at the start 'd maybe give him trouble, but in the long run, now mind ye, in the long run, no mortal man, I reckon, had any business o' rubbin' knees with Wes Cotterell under no earthly checkerboard in all this vale o' tears. I mind onc't there come along a high-toned feller from in around Innopolis summers. Was a lawyer, er some professional kind o' man. He had a big yaller leather kivered book under his arm, and a bunch o' these 'ere big envelopes and a lot o' subpoenies stickin' out o' his breast pocket. Mighty slick lookin' feller he was, wore a stovepipe hat sorto set way back on his head, so's to show off his General Jackson forehead, don't you know. Well, sir, this feller struck the place on some business or other, and then missed the hack 'at orto 'a took him out o' here sooner it did take him out. And whiles he was a loafin' round, sorto lonesome, like a feller allus is in a strange place, you know, he kindo drapped in on our crowd at the shoe shop, ostensibly to git a bootstrap stitched on, but I knowed, the minute he set foot in the door, 'at that feller wanted comp'ny wuzn't cobblin'. Well, as good luck would have it, there set Wes, as usual, with the checkerboard in his lap, a playin' all by hisself, and a whistlin' so low and solemn like and sad it railly made the crowd seem like a religious getherin' o' some kind or other, we was all so quiet and still like, as the man come in. Well, the stranger stated his business, set down, took off his boot, and set there nussin' his foot and talkin' weather for 10 minutes, I reckon, 'fore he ever 'peared to notice Wes at all. We was all back'ard anyhow, 'bout talkin' much. Besides, we knowed, long afore he come in, all about how hot the weather was, and the pore chance there was o' rain, and all that, and so the subject had purty well died out, when jest then the feller's eyes struck Wes and the checkerboard, and I'll never forget the warm salvation smile 'at flashed over him at the promisin' discovery. "What!" says he, a grinnin' like a' angel and a edgin' his cheer towards Wes, "have we a checkerboard and checkers here?" "We have," says I, knowin' 'at Wes wouldn't let go o' that whistle long enough to answer, more'n to mebby nod his head. "And who is your best player?" says the feller, kind o' pitiful like, with another inquirin' look at Wes. "Him," says I, a pokin' Wes with a peg float. But Wes only spit kind o' absent like, and went on with his whistlin'. "Much of a player, is he?" says the feller, with a sorto doubtful smile at Wes agin. "Plays a purty good hickory," says I, a pokin' Wes agin. "Wes," says I, "here's a gentleman 'at'd maybe like to take a hand with you there, and give you a few idees," says I. "Yes," says the stranger, eager like, a settin' his plug hat keerful up in the empty shelvin', and a rubbin' his hands and smilin' as confident like as old Hoyle hisself, "yes, indeed, I'd be glad to give the gentleman," meanin' Wes, "an idee or two about checkers, if he'd just as lief, 'cause I reckon ef there are any one thing 'at I do know more about'n another, it's checkers," says he, "and there are no game 'at delights me more, pervidin', o' course, I find a competitor 'at can make it anyways interestin'." "Got much of a rickord on checkers?" says I. "Well," says the feller, "I don't like to brag, but I've never been beat, in any legitimate contest," says he. "And I've played more'n one o' them," he says, "here and there round the country. Of course your friend here," he went on, smilin' sociable at Wes, "he'll take it all in good part if I should happen to lead him a little, jest as I'd do," he says, "if it was possible for him to lead me." "Wes," says I, "has warmed the wax in the years of some mighty good checker players," says I, as he squared the board around, still a whistlin' to hisself like, as the stranger took his place, a smilin' like, and roachin' back his hair. "Move," says Wes. "No," says the feller, with a polite flourish of his hand, "the first move shall be yourn." And by jucks, for all he wouldn't take even the advantage of a starter, he flaxed it to Wes the first game in less'n 15 minutes. "Right sure you've give me your best player?" he says, smilin' round at the crowd, as Wes set squarin' the board for another game and whistlin' as unconcerned like as if nothin' had happened more'n ordinary. "'S your move," says Wes, a squintin' out into the game 'bout 40 foot from shore, and a whistlin' pert nigh in a whisper. Well, sir, it 'peared like the feller really didn't try to play, and you could see, too, 'at Wes knowed he'd about met his match, and played accordin'. He didn't make no move at all that he didn't give keerful thought to, whilst the feller, well, as I was sayin', it just 'peared like checkers was child's play for him. Put in most of the time 'long through the game a sayin' things calculated to kind of bore an ordinary man, but Wes helt hisself purty level, and didn't show no signs, and kep' up his whistlin' mighty well, considerin'. "Reckon you play the fiddle, too, as well as checkers," says the feller, laughin' as Wes come a whistlin' out of the little end of the second game, and went on a fixin' for the next round. "'S my move," says Wes, 'thout seemin' to notice the feller's tantalizin' words whatsomever. "Well, this time," thinks I, "Mr. Smarty from the Metropolitan Deestricts, you're liable to get waxed, sure." But the feller didn't 'pear to think so at all, and played right ahead as glib like and keerless as ever, 'casionally a throwin' in them sarcastic remarks o' his'n, 'bout bein' slow and sure, 'bout things in general, "like to see that," he said, "like to see fellers do things with plenty of deliberation, and even ef a feller wasn't much of a checker player, like to see him die slow anyhow, and then 'tend his own funeral," he says, "and march in the possession to his own music," says he. And jest then his remarks was brung to a close by Wes a jumpin' 2 men, and a lightin' square in the king row. "Ground that," says Wes, a droppin' back into his old tune. And fer the rest o' that game Wes helt the feller purty level, but had to finally knock under, but by jest the closest kind o' shave o' winnin'. "They ain't much use," says the feller, "a keepin' this thing up, 'less I could manage some way or other to get beat onct in a while." "Move," says Wes, a droppin' back into the same old whistle and a settlin' there. "Music has charms, as the good book tells us," says the feller, kind o' nervous like, and a roachin' his hair back as if some sort o' protracted headache was a settin' in. "Never was skunked, was ye?" says Wes, kind o' student like, with a fur off look in them big white eyes o' his, and then a whistlin' right on 'sef he hadn't said nothin'. "Not much," says the feller, sort o' surprised like, as if such a idee as that had never struck him afore. "Never was skunked myself, but I've saw fellers in my time 'at was," says he. But from that time on I noticed the feller 'peared to play more keerful, and r'aly launched into the game with somethin' like interest. Wes he seemed to be jest a limberin' up like, and sir blame me ef he didn't walk the feller's log fer him that time, 'thout no 'pearent trouble at all. "And now," says Wes, all quiet like, a squarin' the board for another'n, "we're kindo' gettin' at things right. Move." And away went that little unconcerned whistle o' his again, and Mr. City Man jest gettin' white and sweaty too, he was so nervous. Nor he didn't 'pear to find much to laugh at in the next game, nor the next 2 games nuther. Things was a gettin' mighty interestin' about them times, and I guess the feller was serious like about wakin' up to the solemn fact 'at it took about all his spare time to keep up his end o' the row, and even that state o' poor satisfaction was a creepin' furder and furder away from him ever' new turn he undertook. Whilst Wes jest appeared to get more deliberate and certain ever' game, and that unendin', self-satisfied and comfortin' little whistle o' his never dropped a stitch, but toed out ever' game alike, towards the last, and, fer the most part, disasterous to the fellow 'at had started it with sich confidence and act'al promise, don't you know. Well, sir, the feller stuck the whole forenoon out, and then the afternoon, and then knuckled down to it way into the night, yes, and plumb midnight, and he buckled into the thing bright and airly next morning. And, sir, for 2 long days and nights, a hardly a stoppin' long enough to eat, the feller stuck it out, and Wes a jest a warpin' it to him hand over fist, and leavin' him furder behind ever' game, till finally, towards the last, the feller got so blamed on worked up and excited like, he jest 'peared act'ally pert nigh plumb crazy and hysterical as a woman. It was a gettin' late into the shank of the second day, and the boys had jest a little candle fer 'em to fetch out one o' the clostest games the feller'd played Wes fer some time. But Wes was jest as cool and ca'm as ever, and still a whistlin' consolin' to hisself like, whilst the feller jest 'peared wore out and ready to drap right in his tracks any minute. "Durn you!" he snarled out at Wes, "hain't you never goin' ter move?" And there set Wes a-balancin' a checker man above the board, a-studyin' where to set it, and a-fillin' in the time with that 'ere whistle. "Flames and flashes!" says the feller again, "will you ever stop that death-seducin' tune o' yourn long enough to move?" And as Wes deliberately set his man down where the feller see he'd have to jump it and lose 2 men and a king, Wes was a-singin' low and sad like as if all to hisself: "Oh, we'll move that man and leave him there fer the love of Barbary Allen." Well, sir, the feller jest jumped to his feet, upset the board, and tore out of the shop stark starin' crazy, blame if he wasn't! 'Cause some of us put out after him and overtook him way beyont the pike bridge, and hollered to him, and he shuck his fist at us and hollered back and says he, "If you fellers over here," says he, "'ll agree to muzzle that dern checker player o' yourn, I'll bet $1,500 to 15 cents 'at I kin beat him 11 games out of every dozen, but there are no money," he says, "'at kin hire me to play him again, on this aboundin' airth, only on them conditions, 'cause that dern, eternal, infernal, dad-blasted whistle o' his'd beat the oldest man in Ameriky." End of The Champion Checker Player of Ameriky,